Two things that are absolutely central for any good story. Number one, round characters. Number two, a steady setting. Now, there's much more to a good story, of course. But if you don't, in the first place, have round characters and a steady setting, then the story is going to be uninspiring and hard to follow. So what are round characters? Well, round characters are simply characters who change throughout a story. Characters who learn and grow and expand and ultimately transform. And what is a steady setting? A steady setting is not necessarily an exciting or exotic setting. Oftentimes, it's far from it. Instead, a steady setting is simply a setting against which the story can develop, a steady background against which the characters can change. Because, you see, if the setting keeps changing, that is, if the action of the story keeps taking place in different locations, then these shifting settings will render the changes in the characters almost impossible to see. And so again, round characters and a steady setting. And thus endeth the high school freshman English lesson with a quick word on two crucial components of any compelling and cogent story. And speaking of compelling and cogent stories, I want us to imagine ourselves into such a story this morning. Which is to say, I want us to step into that upstairs room in which the disciples are gathered in Acts chapter 2. Now in Acts chapter 1, the text says that after the risen Jesus had withdrawn from the disciples at the Mount of Bethany, that those disciples then returned to Jerusalem to this very upper room where for days and days and days, quote, these were constantly devoting themselves to prayer, together with certain women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, as well as Jesus' brother. So, constantly together in this specific room, praying. So, as we begin our imaginative work, this is our setting, an upper room in which the disciples have been now for close to 10 days. And here are the characters, the disciples and various members of Jesus' family. And so here now is what I want us to do by way of imagination. I want us to step into that room, and I want us to listen to their prayers. What do we hear? What do we hear? Prayers for clarity on what has just happened. Prayers for Jesus to reveal himself to other loved ones who as yet don't believe this crazy story that they're now telling. Prayers for their own safety, as they know that folks sympathetic to Jesus are being abused and ill-treated. Prayers for peace amid their anxiety. What else do we hear them praying for? I'll give you a moment to listen with the ears of your heart. Okay, now what do we hear them talking about? I mean, surely they were not just praying all that time. Surely they were talking and sharing stories during that period too. So what do we hear them saying? Listen closely. We hear them sharing with one another their fear and trepidation. We hear them inquiring of one another whether they really did believe he was coming back. We hear them together trying to discern what the substance of their hope now was, whether they dared to hope. And then we hear them telling stories. You remember that time Jesus ticked off his entire hometown synagogue and they about threw him off a cliff? We can hear them saying. You remember that time when James and John sidled up to Jesus and said, "Hey, Jesus, we want you to do whatever we ask of you." And remember how Jesus scoffed at them for this ridiculous request? What were you fools thinking? You remember that time that Jesus asked us to go and get food for all those people? And Andrew brought him 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Like that was going to do the trick. We can hear them laughing together. But then we hear one of them say, "Do you remember how we ran that night?" And then we hear the room go quiet, shame spreading through the air like a bad smell. "Y'all should have seen him there on that cross," we can hear one of the women say, as another of the women puts her arm around Mary because Mary can't bear to relive it. Do y'all remember how his first word to us when he came again was peace? Even after all we did to him, even after all we didn't do for him, still we can hear them saying, "Do you remember how his first word to us was peace?" Can we hear it? These sounds coming from that room. Now, I lift all of this up in advance of turning our attention to Acts chapter 2 and the Pentecost story, so as to make a very important point this morning, which is that according to Luke's narrative, the disciples are together in a room in which they have been gathering for some 10 straight days to pray and to reflect and simply to be together. And thus, Luke's account of the amazing Pentecost story begins with this simple sentence, and I quote, "When the day of Pentecost had come, they were together in one place." Now, after this, of course, comes the remarkable story of the rushing winds and the tongues of fire, which is followed, of course, by the heretofore fearful disciples suddenly taking to the streets and proclaiming the news of Jesus resurrected, which is followed, of course, by Peter's sermon and by the first post-resurrection conversions to the way of Jesus. And all of that, of course, is wondrous and mind-boggling and worthy of praise and honor and certainly worthy of a Pentecost sermon. But for today, on this Pentecost Sunday, I want us to dig deeply into that first verse. That verse that serves as something of a precondition for everything else that follows. That simple little sentence that says, "When the day of Pentecost had come, they were together in one place." Let me tell you about two of my favorite quotes by two of my favorite writers. The first is a quote from the celebrated pastor-writer Frederick Buechner, in which Buechner writes, "You can survive on your own. You can grow strong on your own. You can prevail on your own. But you cannot become human on your own." And then here now is the quote from Wendell Berry. "Most people nowadays are looking for a better place, which means most of them will end up in no place." Now, taken together, these two quotes make the case that A, we need to be in community with other people to truly become full human beings, and B, that to be in community requires a commitment to a specific place. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were together in one place. All right, let me tell you a quick story. About a month ago, the first day of Anderson 5 spring break, whenever that was, I went on a walk in our neighborhood with Ada and Juliana. We were ultimately walking to AU that day, where the girls had been dying to try a burger from that food truck that now camps out in the corner of the campus. I'm sure most of you have seen it. You see, our neighborhood backs right up to the AU campus, and we've been given permission by one of our neighbors to cut through their backyard so as to access AU and ultimately walk up here to the church, which we do all the time. Well, that day, Ada and Juliana and I were on our way for burgers, and as we crested a hill in our neighborhood, Ada pointed down to a spot at the bottom of the hill, and she said, "Do you think the honeysuckle will be there yet down at Honeysuckle Forest?" Well, to appreciate this story, you have to know this. Our first spring here in Anderson, when the two were just little girls, y'all remember those days, right? They're not so small anymore. During our first spring here, as we walked around and explored our neighborhood, we came across all sorts of lovely and attention-grabbing sights. And over time, through repeated walks and exposure and simply being together, we slowly began to give some of those places names. For instance, there's Birdtopia, which is an uninhabited cul-de-sac at the back of our neighborhood. It's a place in which dozens of birds can be found at any time, flying from tree to tree to tree. It's Birdtopia. And then there's Firefly Forest, where come summertime, it looks each evening like an explosion of fireworks due to the thousands of fireflies that light up there each second. And I could go on and on with these places and names that we've come up with, but this time, on this day, Ada was pointing down to a place that we have dubbed Honeysuckle Forest. It's a small patch of ground that derives its name from the abundance of honeysuckle that grows there each year in the early spring. And to set the stage once again for this story that I'm trying to tell you, we were walking together, these daughters of mine who like yesterday were just little girls, but who are now burgeoning young women. The three of us were walking together that day, and as we began down the hill, Ada pointed forward and said, "Do you think the honeysuckle will be there yet, down in Honeysuckle Forest?" Well, as she said that, a breeze suddenly began to pick up. And with my hair blowing in the wind, I just as suddenly felt a warmth beginning to spread through me that couldn't possibly be put into human language. And please understand that it had absolutely nothing to do with my daughter's desire for honeysuckle. Instead, it had everything to do with the feeling of closeness and intimacy and togetherness, along with the bittersweet awareness of the passing of time that made me feel suddenly so close to and bound to these two young girls with whom I was walking. I felt in that moment an abundance, an overflowing abundance of love and joy and peace, of kindness and gentleness and goodness. In short, it was a Pentecost moment. The wind and the fire of God's Holy Spirit coming over me once more, but it was made possible only because of the clear setting and because of the round characters in which and with whom I was walking. And that's the end of the story. Dear family, Wendell Berry is right. Our culture is obsessed with moving. Moving on, moving up, biggering and bettering, running from boredom and always seeking the newest experience. But that kind of living makes for a flat life. Because that kind of living makes necessarily for flat characters. Characters for whom the sum total of a life might be chocked full of exciting instances, but a life in which those instances have never been integrated into any sort of meaningful whole. Because for that kind of integration to take place, one needs a steady setting. One needs a place. A place that one dwells in long enough that the sights and the smells and the sounds become a part of oneself, become a part of one's story. A place where things begin to even warrant names due to their closeness and their familiarity to us. And Frederick Buechner is right too. We can achieve a lot on our own. We can experience a great many things on our own. But we cannot become fully human on our own. Because to be fully human means to be drawn out of ourselves by and for others. Yes, to be fully human means, for instance, to be thinking about how much we ourselves want a tasty burger, but then to be completely drawn out of our own self-absorbed desires on account of another's recognition of the beauty and the majesty of the familiar world right around us. And I say all of this on this Pentecost Sunday so as to make this crucial point, which is that when we come together to worship as the family of Boulevard Baptist Church, we don't just worship somewhere. with anybody. Instead, we worship in this place, among these people. By which I mean, just like in the case of our imaginative work surrounding those disciples in that upper room, I ask you now, how many of our most important life stories have happened right here? How many of our deepest fears have been shared with one another right here? How much laughter and frivolity has happened right here? How many heartbreaks have been comforted right here? How many lives have been celebrated right here? And to the point of this sermon, how many of these precious experiences would be rendered almost unintelligible if they had happened somewhere other than right here? So I bring all of this up on this Pentecost Sunday to remind us that we don't just come here to be at church on Sunday mornings. We come here because together we are becoming more fully human each time we gather here. And we come here because in order to become more fully human, we have to have a place. When the day of Pentecost had come, they were together in one place. So it was that day of Pentecost, and so too is it on this day of Pentecost. We too are together in one place, our place. And so then, knowing that the conditions are in place for a truly compelling and cogent story, let us therefore open ourselves to the possibility of those surprising Holy Spirit winds to blow through our hearts and our lives once more, warming us in ways that can't be put into human language, but in ways in which we more clearly see and feel and share the signs of the Holy Spirit: love and joy and peace and patience, kindness and gentleness and faithfulness and self-control. Yes, might we open ourselves to those Holy Spirit winds so that we may continue to be changed, and so that we will slowly but surely be gloriously transformed. And all God's people said,